Hi, everyone.
Hi, Marco.
How is it going?
I'm good. What about you?
Yeah, it's pretty good. Uh, Lee should join us in a few seconds. So yeah, let's wait for him.
All right.
Hello, hello.
Hi, Lee.
How are we doing?
Fine. What about you?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad. Um, Maya, hello. Maybe lurking and not. I believe I received a message about wanting to. Oh, hello.
Hello, Lee.
How you
How are you?
doing?
I'm good. What about you?
Yeah, very good. Thanks. Very good. I'm sorry, I don't think anyone's come back to me yet about reaching out, but I do hope someone will be able to jump on a call with you. Although we can maybe cover some of the stuff now. So you're interested in UX and design, right?
Yes, I am.
So it's an interesting area because like I don't really know, first of all, what your definition is, and even necessarily what the GitLab definition is. Let me just, oh, we're already recording. Perfect. So the challenge I see at the moment is that more than anything, that I would consider like a lot of UX and design contributions not to properly be recognized as contributions, because generally, and I'm probably got this wrong, right? But the design and the UX part happens not as part of the code as such. So, you know, like me or Marco will spin up a merge request and we'll have a random stab at making the UI bit, and then we'll ask someone from the UX team to kind of review it and give us some input and feedback. If we're really on the ball, we might even ask for that before we start the work. But I think more often than not, we first show that we want to get something done, and that we can functionally achieve what we want to achieve, and then we kind of collaborate with the relevant design team. Does that sound fairly accurate, Marco?
Yeah, you left out, you missed the part where we shoot ourselves in the foot, but yeah.
Sometimes, exactly. So yeah, I'm not really sure how that like how we obviously what we definitely want contributions when it comes to design and UX, but I think I need someone from that area of GitLab really to help me, you, everyone understand how that collaboration can be successful.
I think that if you want to collaborate or contribute to the UI and UX, the two main projects are definitely the GitLab UI and the pajamas documentations.
So
if you find any issue, or you think that for example, the UX documentation that's on the pajamas project, if you find any issue with that,
would you mind sharing your screen and having a quick look at the issue trackers for us on those, Marco? And
let me find them.
Because the GitLab, and forgive me, are you technical as well? Would you be able to, because the GitLab UI project I consider to be a very technical, it's got some CSS in there, but it's primarily like a component library. So if there was an issue in there that was about kind of making one of the components more compliant or building a new component or something like that, would that be something that you could take on?
Oh, sorry, I didn't get you. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. So this is pajamas. So I'm interested. So have you read a little bit about the pajamas design system?
Yeah, I did. I was going through all the links yesterday. I was like overwhelmed. There was so much links.
I can totally understand that, and I really, really appreciate you starting to do some research. So, Marco, if you can indulge us, what kind of issues are there in this project? Because I be honest, I've never really looked at this issue tracker to sort of
usually see. There are issues about like if there are issues with the UX compliant and stuff like that. For example, I don't think we went through an issue and we went straight up to an MR, but for example, for the drawer component, there was some discussion on where to put the action buttons, because using the flow, it makes more sense to have them at the bottom instead of at the top. So I did start that on Slack, and they opened an MR directly, but opening an issue here would have been perfect.
But
so
then,
yeah, go on.
What I guess I'm trying to understand is the difference between, so first of all, like UX and design seems more, what's the word I'm looking for? Is it subjective or objective, or as opposed to when we build stuff, right? We have a feature or a function that we want and we build it, and you can say either it does what it's supposed to do or it doesn't. So that's one side of it. The other side, I guess, is like understanding, because if these issues in this backlog are clearly indicated, which we know is always a struggle, but like, oh, this one is sort of signed off. I don't know if that's the right term, but it's like the difference between, oh, this is an issue where someone says we need to figure out should the buttons be at the top or the bottom, but then I don't know like how and who can actually make that decision. I guess it's a collaboration, but
Oh yeah,
I
definitely.
guess I'm trying to understand, like, are there some issues in here that we can say, oh, this issue has been created and it already has like an implementation plan, or it already has agreement or approval or consensus or whatever we want to call it. And then, you know, you could then try and work on that issue.
Yeah, because I think that the flow of working on UI and UX component is, if you find an issue or you want to make a proposal for the UX part, you first open it here and discuss with the UX team. And this serves as a guideline for then implement the component on the GitLab UI project.
Okay.
Because this, the Pajamas design system is basically the source of truth of how the GitLab UI components should look and behave.
That makes sense. So are you technical as well, Maya?
Sorry, I don't understand your definition of being technical.
So if Marco, do you think we can find one of these issues that we'll just jump into a few round, maybe one with some, I don't know if comments is good or bad, but I'm hoping there's one that we can see that like is a clear, well, that's about as unclear as it gets.
Yeah, pretty much.
I'm hoping there'll be one that's quite sort of.
I wonder if there are labels that we could use.
Okay, I can see understand pain points and opportunities for customer of Figma library.
Okay, so that 1697. That's
169, this one.
Yeah.
Hello?
So what do we think about this one?
Okay.
Yeah, but this is more related to Figma and the Figma library that GitLab makes public. Yeah, and also the other thing is that contributors outside of the GitLab team don't have access to Figma. So we can basically only discuss the changes to the components layout or behavior and stuff like that, but we need someone from GitLab to actually make the changes in Figma.
Okay, so we know issues labeled with Figma are probably bad then. Okay.
Probably.
Let me just while you're doing it, it's unlikely, but while you're doing that, I'm going to see if there's a UXy person that I can get to join the call.
Based on discussion with this to bring it
Okay.
For example, deprecate the path component, but I don't really know. Yeah, it's not easy to find something in here. Let's see the labels.
Optimistic, but I've dropped a note in the channel just in case someone is available to jump on and help us. Do you want to maybe open the GitLab UI issue tracker? I feel like those ones are more specifically probably technical, but maybe not. That sort of say like, you know, oh, for this component, we need to either like refactor this or fix this or change this, or
Yes.
because I'm just totally out of my depth in the pajamas one.
Yeah, the pajamas design system project is really
Oh,
oh
Dan, you
hey.
come to the rescue.
Yes.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Dan, how you doing?
2 weeks into moving house, it's chaos.
So we're the last thing you need, but hopefully you saw a tiny bit of the background. So Maya's really kindly looking to try and help contribute to design and UX, and I'm sort of somewhat speaking on behalf of Marco as well, but I certainly I'm not great at understanding really the proper definitions, and I also understand that different people, different companies can define things in different ways. I started by sort of saying that I think there's probably a certain amount that's very challenging because it's more, I don't know if objective or subjective is the term, where it's kind of these conversations that need to happen and decisions that need to be made, and that would probably be very hard, if not impossible, to contribute to. But then we've probably got X amount of stuff that's already been, you know, there's either an issue raised already with some kind of implementation plan, or an issue that's had some conversation and some agreements being made. Or so let me stop talking nonsense and just see if you've got any immediate thoughts or wisdom to share with us on how a wider community member might be able to kind of help out when it comes to design and UX. Put you on the spot as much as I put myself on the spot.
Thanks, Lee. So I think, would it be helpful to talk a little bit about how design and UX works at GitLab, and then jump into the different ways to contribute to those types of areas?
I'd love that background myself. Yeah, we got a thumbs up there as well. Awesome.
Cool. Fantastic.
I'll stop sharing the screen.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Nice. So oh man, my head is so fuzzy. My first day back was yesterday. Well, the UX team is set up in 3 different functions. We've got UX research, we've got product design, and we've got technical writing. My assumption is that right now we're looking for contributions to the product design side more than the UX research and the technical writing. Get nods. Cool. Carry on. So the product design function typically works in there's two main ways to contribute. There's contributing to the principles and the tools that all of the designers use. A lot of that is captured in the pajamas design system. And then there's the GitLab, the product itself. And typically their designers will be assigned to specific features and work closely with product managers and engineers, similar to many other functions who'd want to contribute to GitLab the app. So there are lots of zooming in on the app, there are lots of issues that need a solution. For example, myself and Lee were taking a look at one, I guess it was a month or so ago now, where there was a page with navigating between 2 different types of views, and there were questions to be asked and answered by anyone, but product designers are typically quite good at asking these questions of why are we doing these changes, what are people trying to do, so you can contribute to those discussions. And then the next step of that would be, how does that actually look in the UI? So a designer could contribute by providing some kind of artifacts, be they scribbles, wireframes, visuals for how it should look. And that artifacts would be informed by the design system. And in the design system, we've got many gray boxes that say to do in the documentation. Perhaps when I talk about the design system, it's helpful to perhaps zoom out what I mean by that. We've got design.gitlab.com, which is documentation for behaviors and patterns for things and some of the core principles behind it. We've got a UI kit in Figma, which the designers use to produce some of these artifacts and visuals. And there's a community version of that published, which is the exact same as the one we use internally, but it's a little bit delayed. It has a monthly publish, but you can see the most up-to-date one. And there's gaps in that that you can contribute to the UI kit. And there's also GitLab UI, which is the coded version of the intention that's captured in design.gitlab.com and the visuals captured in the UI kit. So that's a little bit rambly, but perhaps it's a good time to stop and say, is there any questions about any of that? And has it helped at all?
Help me, but I'd love to hear Maya's thoughts so far based on my rambling and your rambling. Okay, silence at the moment. So is it worth us? I wonder whether we should just dive into, because what we often use today's session for is just kind of pairing on an issue and moving forwards. I feel like I can get away with this in, as you brought it up, Dan, the issue that we were looking at together. Maybe we could sort of do a bit of
No, we can't hear you, Maya.
You're muted.
Oh my God, I've been talking since. I'm so sorry.
No, go on, far away.
All right, thank you, Dan. I would love to contribute to the GitHub UX parts. Although I'm not very good at coding, but I'm good with product design, UX design, and all of that. And I would love like a lot of guidance, because I'm actually in love with open source. I'm a contributor at Async API Initiative, and I'm also a technical writer and a design and website maintainer. So I would love to do more here, and as well learn from you folks. Thank you.
Awesome. So I think that could work quite well then, if we were to have a bit of a look at this issue specifically, Dan, and then I wonder if there's issues or merge requests that we could then dig up some, like whether they're yours, Dan, or someone else's, that maybe ones especially that are complete, so we can actually see the dialogue that took place. And I think I'm right in saying that quite often you refer to the design. So like when if let's dig this issue up that I'm sort of vaguely talking about.
I think I have a completely more to have a look at later.
Okay. It's this one I think we've been looking at. So again, this is a little bit weird in a way, because it's a merge request that the conversation's happening on rather than an issue. But we might find some sort of previously completed ones that are good to kind of see the conversation, the discussion. So where we've sort of got to. So yeah, let me step back, and I probably need GDK now, which I haven't got to hand. I introduced a new feature into GitLab a couple of years ago, a year or two ago, but it's behind a feature flag. So it's kind of in experimental testing phase at the moment. And the feature adds two kind of concepts to GitLab. It adds contacts and it adds organizations. Now, at the moment, they're behind two separate menu items. Now, Dan, maybe you can remind me for the first kind of question that I'm still a little bit unsure of is why is that a big deal? Do you do you know the answer to that? Do you feel comfortable answering that?
Is that question for Maya?
No, for Dan, sorry.
All right.
Let me find the most up to date.
Because again, this is where you'll be great because you'll cite a specific paragraph somewhere, which rather than, you know, me taking anyone's word for it, it's very specifically like, yeah, we call that out here.
Okay, is this a so I have a reference. What I'm trying to do is work out if it's a shareable reference or if it's a safe.
Okay,
reference.
no worries. Yeah. It might, it's
GitLab.
probably already on here, so I'll keep reading while you're looking anyway.
GitLab SaaS paid NPS. Is that public? Please be public. No, it doesn't look like it's been released publicly.
Okay.
So I can't share the actual screen, but I can share a summary because I'm sure that's fine. We've seen in the most recent survey that went out last quarter, we've seen feedback about how there are too many features in GitLab in general. So I'm thinking that that would tie into why we'd try and simplify or reduce the number of features that we expose through the navigation.
That seems like a reasonable reasonable statement. And in fact, I think I was talking with Daniel on my team last night. One of the challenges, although I don't want to get you into this debate right now, but on our new contributor study, like one of the challenges that arose was, you know, someone that's new to the platform doesn't even know where to find issues and merge requests, which are two probably the most prominent things that an open source contributor is going to need to find. So I guess definitely the fewer things that we can have down here, the easier it'll be to find what you're interested in. So let's take that then as the start. So at the moment, we've got these two screens. We've got contacts and we've got organizations. The screens look very, very similar. You can filter active, inactive, and all. You can do a search. You can create a new record, and there's a table that lists all of the current records with pagination, etc. But somehow we want to reduce from having two menu items, for one for each of these screens, to somehow have one menu item. And that's kind of the conversation that's been going on so far. So I'll sort of skim, and I'll drop this link in the chat as well. And skim and sort of say like what some of the ideas we've explored, and maybe we can just continue that exploration to sort of see how this kind of conversation looks. So yeah, one idea would be a drop down to switch between the two. Another idea would be having segmented control. I think when I then dug into that, we found out that control maybe doesn't actually exist or isn't really meant to work in the way that we want to implement that.
Yeah, it's that the specific implementation of it is not fit for use, but the pattern is okay.
Okay. So I might be tempted to revisit the we like boring solutions, right? A lot of the time, i.e. the simplest thing, especially if we're going to iterate. So one of my temptations might be to sort of pose the question now, if we were to have something really simple like a button, and maybe on, I guess we only, I don't know, it just doesn't look very nice, right? But a hyperlink could basically be enough. So when you're on contacts, you can click onto organizations, and when you're on organizations, you can click on contacts. So maybe we'll entertain that idea in a minute, or see if we can simplify things. We talked about using a button group. We then talked about the fact that we've already got tabbed layout for active, inactive, and all. And maybe we don't actually need this, and instead we can have the tabs to flip between contacts and organizations. I like the look of that is brilliant.
I like that idea.
Yeah. So then there's a question, if we're losing the active and inactive, then how do we kind of switch out? I can't remember if I've had an issue with this.
I think that if you go down that route, then you could have a state or status choice on the filter bar.
Yes.
That would align with issues, MRs, and all the other search
Well,
pages.
it doesn't align with issues and MRs, because if you think about it, you do still have the tabbed. I think that I really like this. I can't remember what I actually said about it. It looks like I might have glossed over it a bit, unfortunately. This I feel like would not allow you to see only inactive, because you've only got two states to show only active or to show both. I don't know whether that's a big deal or not. Probably not a huge deal, to be honest. And it's simpler than introducing, because this isn't a GL filtered search yet. So with issues.
But you like working with GL filters.
Oh God, don't shoot me now. I think it looks amazing. Its functionality is brilliant, but yeah, it's caused me much pain. So yeah, I think, Dan, I really like this, and I'm upset with myself because I don't seem to have kind of really responded directly to that one and said, yeah, let's go with that. So I'm just going to keep scrolling through for a minute, and then yeah, maybe we can circle back and sort of say, well,
can I interject quickly?
Please do.
So this, up to this point, this sort of discussion is a great place for those interested in design and UX and product to contribute. And this is a really good way of contributing. It's public, lots of people can see it. As you can see, we've got three members of the UX team here, Marcin, Nick, myself. We can refer to it. We're 2 months later. I have no real memory of what this was, but thankfully it was all written down there, so I don't need to pretend anymore. So I think that's one really good way to contribute. And the next comment that we were going to get to is a second really good way that I think product designers can contribute. So if you scroll up a bit again, the questions that I didn't do a very good job of explaining, asking questions like this, I think is really valuable for product designers to contribute to. Bring the why to the surface, try and make the assumptions, the stuff that's hidden, visible, because when it is, the solutions can often write themselves.
So with the answers in mind, and it's like, I guess this that I've mocked up is basically what you did before. So I'm really kicking myself for almost ignoring you there. Sorry, Dan. I've pretty much proposed the same solution you did. So that seems to be where I'm leaning at the moment. Being that you suggested that months ago, does that still seem like quite a good approach to you, Dan? And knowing the backstory or a little bit more about the use case, and feel free to grill me more about that now.
Yeah, so I think I'm not confident in saying if it's good or not, because I'm struggling to visualize how a more literal how people use it. Like, I understand, oh, I'm looking at a thing and I want to hit the contacts, and I think I'm missing what decisions are made.
I'll try and give you a sort of a story or whatever you want to call it, and you can interject at any point. So I think Marco works in a very similar way, but my old company kind of work in this way. So, you know, as an example, we might get an email in from our kind of website, from the contact form, and it'll be from someone we've not had any dealings with in the past. So the first thing we'll probably do is hop into the contacts and search for that contact, just to make sure that they're not already in the system. And I guess that would be a scenario where actually searching across all active and inactive would actually make sense, because it might be someone that you have dealt with in the past, but they've subsequently, you know, they're no longer a customer. So you do want to search across the entire base. So search for them, right? Okay, we can't find them, right? What company do they work at? Okay, Virgin Atlantic, right? Is that a customer? Is that a company in the organizations? No, they're not. Okay, so we've kind of done.
If you just pause there, that's our first I'm switching between these two contexts moment, isn't it?
Yes.
And
you might do the other, although we don't expose it yet, you could sort of almost argue the opposite going forwards. If we were to allow you to see all of the contacts at a company, we don't currently expose that. There's not a way to click on a company and see all of the contacts at that company. But if we were to do that in the future, that might make you take the opposite, or you could argue, anyone, Marco might say, well, no, I would do the opposite. Actually, I would search for the company first. But
just to drop another idea on the table, what if you have one single page divided like into two columns or two rows, the above or the left with the organizations that you can click one and then see the details of that organization, which is basically the list of contacts for that specific organization? Then you don't even have to switch between pages.
So there's a couple of things. Again, I'm sure that Dan will have much better views on it, but immediately that I'm thinking, information cramming could be quite challenging. Like, so top and bottom, I imagine, would be quite a hard thing to do, just because of the way people's screens work, and like not knowing how many contacts, although I guess you got pagination, so you know roughly the height, but having to scroll up and down. Left and right, I don't feel like you'd have the screen real estate unless we were to drop a bunch of columns. Dan, do you got any thoughts on kind of having two things? I can't think of anywhere else in GitLab that we maybe have that's maybe a similar kind of, maybe something like the settings screens, where we have like collapsible sections that have like settings related to different things. Or
just catching up on these comments. Yeah, draws. Thanks for raising that. The draws are something that allow you to maintain your context and see more information. Whether that would be the best pattern here, I'm not sure.
So we already use a drawer to when we click on a record to edit it or to create a new record. I don't know whether that's good or bad, or that prohibits us from going down that route to.
Yeah, I think it's the best way I can say it is it's a pattern with challenges. It's
Okay.
not a good pattern, it's not a bad pattern. The design system doesn't give, for many cases, a satisfactory way of looking at two bits of information at the same time. So same for the side-by-side idea that Marco suggested. This way of having the two things and the disclosure. As far as I'm aware, we don't have a good pattern that we can say to people, hey, use this one and it'll work for you 95% of the time with no problems at all, no extra work. But it's not to say that it wouldn't work in this instance. If we had confidence that a new page was problematic. If a new page is not problematic, doesn't slow users down considerably, or makes it harder to use, then that seems boring solution without dropping quality to me, perhaps.
The side-by-side option.
As I understand it, the side-by-side option is to avoid having to go to a new page. And my question is, what's bad about the new page that we're trying to avoid?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
If we don't have confidence that a new page is bad, then the boring solution is to use a new page, and a safer solution, because.
Got it. So sorry, yeah. I thought you were suggesting side-by-side was the boring solution,
No,
but no,
because we don't have a pattern that we can point to and say, hey, use this, all the code's there, we've tested it, we know it works.
Yeah. So if doing something like this, then this though would have to, what's the word I'm looking for? This would be a client side solution, the way I see it, right? So I think I would have to combine the contacts and the organization components, or maybe I wouldn't. Maybe this, I had to forget what it is, like GL tabs maybe provides a really easy way of me to just drop the contacts component on one tab and the organizations component on the other tab.
I'm not sure, sorry. But now you've come back to this though. In your example, the story that you gave,
yeah,
I'm considering the order. So we're asking to choose customer or contact an organization first and then search. And why that way around, and not do your search and then go afterwards, I want to search contacts for this, or I want to search organizations for this. Because at the minute we're making that choice of contacts and organizations first. Should it be a second choice? And what are the advantages or disadvantages of that?
I didn't quite follow that. Sorry. So are you saying that? So at the moment, I'm just trying to. I don't know if it's alive yet. Trying to enable the feature flag so we can actually see it in action. So yeah, at the moment you've got the choice. You can go straight into contacts or straight into organizations. Are you sort of asking a question about if we've only got one menu item, how do we decide which one is the default? Or
I'm coming back to your story that you were telling about a new an unknown email has come through, and you're trying to establish if it's someone someone who's in the system at all.
Mhm.
And
So-
you said
I went with contacts first, and I guess because I feel like it's more specific. So I might find the company, but the contact might not exist for that company. So I think that's why I would tend to look for the contact first and then the company. But I mean either way is just as valid, and it's almost a personal preference that I would say. I don't feel like one is necessarily the right or wrong way to do that.
no, but would a better experience be being able to search both of those things from the same search?
I don't think so. I can't say like
because this way with the tabs, we're forcing people to make a choice
yeah.
and then perform their search. And if they change their mind, they've got to go to a new place to then do. It might be the same search or a similar search.
I think
so.
the concerns I have if we were to switch it is obviously the back end is already built. That they're two fairly separate things, so we'd have to sort of find a way, whether it be on the front end that we actually execute two queries and then combine the results, or whether we have to completely rework the back end to allow a search across both entities. So I'm really interested in this kind of thought process and discussion, and this could definitely be a really nice way to rework and really redesign something. But I feel like within the scope of this, trying to find a simpler, quicker, easier solution, I don't know that we could achieve that, if that makes sense. Because I think technically there's a lot involved in being able to rework it so that you can search across both at the same time. And what you gain from it isn't I sort of understand what you're saying, because I don't have to switch to another screen, but ultimately you always know what you're searching for. So, if I'm searching for Bob, then I know that I'm searching for a person, a contact. And if I'm searching for Virgin, I know that I'm searching for a company or an organization. So I see that it would be a nice UX not to have to jump across to another screen, but the technical implementation of that, I think, would be a lot more challenging, if that's fair to say.
Yeah, I think go ahead, Marco.
Yeah, the two entities are completely separated, like two different tables and stuff. So the only real way to do this on the backend would make a search and then an union to merge the results together.
And then you've got to work out how to display them on the front end when they've got different columns, etc.
Yeah, well, you could do that because with GraphQL you pass back the type of the entity, so you know if it's a contact or an organization on the front end. So that would be doable.
One thing, just so we don't wait so long, isn't the CRM just a toggle in the group settings, so you don't need to wait for the Rails console to toggle the feature flag?
You could be right. Let me have a look. I must admit, I don't know why. This is obviously my GCK not behaving. Nicholas always knows the shortcuts. Thank you. Right, now we've got our contacts in our organization. So if we want to actually point and click rather than just looking at screenshots, it can be helpful. Yeah, so going back to hopefully a more boring, a simpler, a quicker, easier, unless my GDK, maybe it has just completely crashed, the fact that the Rails console isn't opening.
I think for product designers contributing, it's helpful to ask these bigger vision and direction questions.
Okay.
Even if what's built isn't we'd never try and do all of that jump in one go, but you can't iterate towards nowhere, so you have to have an end destination in sight. So product designers who want to contribute can help by surfacing that end destination for the bigger things, so that
what I really like about potentially that if we did open that up so that this searched across both, what we could maybe do, so let's say we went with this kind of solution for our sort of quick win shorter term, we have, or more specifically your slightly better mock-up with the toggle. If we go for this, then I'm just trying to think how it would. Yeah, that is interesting. So, because these are normally they're kind of context aware, if you will. So this doesn't just show the total number of contacts. So if I search for Randy, then it tells me how many. So I'm just trying to, what I was going to suggest is this is great because we could initially, if you search for Randy, then this will update, but this, like maybe we wouldn't show a number next to the one that's not active. Maybe we would only show the number next to the one that's active because, you know, we don't want to make all these extra GraphQL calls, etc. But what if we iterate towards your solution where you can search for either or, maybe you're on one tab and you only see the results from that tab. But if you could see the number at the top to show that it found this number in here and this number in here, then you can quickly switch. But like it's already made the search, found the results, you know there were results, and you've just got to click to switch to toggle the tab.
Well, you could do that without actually making, like, fetching all the data, because to get that number, you could send the filter to both the contact search and the organization search and only return the count. Yeah,
well, actually, they're even, I think I was going to say they're separate endpoints, but I'm not so sure now. I can't remember. Maybe they're not. But yeah, you're right.
We're getting quite deep in implementation details. That
true. Yeah. Okay, let's try and a quick solution there, or not a quick solution, but you know, it's really interesting. Like you said, we've gone through. You said this is a good example of one where there's been sort of some discussion and conversation. I think we've got a bit of an idea of where we could want to end up, but as a quick solution, because again, you can see how long this has been going on for, and all I'm wanting to do is enable this by default. That's all I really want to do, but I've kind of been roped into fixing or improving the UX as part of defaulting this to on. So do you think we're in a position to be able to make a kind of, okay, like this is a nice, boring, quick, easy, simple solution, and then we could maybe try and get down a bit better on paper what we might work towards?
So we've found in our scenario explaining, we've spoke about one way that people would want to switch between contacts and organizations, and that's when you're searching for a new inquiry. Could you talk about some other times when people would jump between the two?
Yeah, absolutely.
Any solution should, work for all of those, shouldn't it?
So I wouldn't. That's the interesting thing. I wouldn't say you would often be jumping between the two. So two other immediate scenarios that come to mind. Oh, it's January. You've put your prices up. Billing rate is something that's stored in here. So for this one, you would be going into your organizations. You would click into each organization and update the rates So that's, again, you're just isolated to organizations there. The other scenario specifically, you're dealing with an individual, maybe that individual saying, oh, I'm leaving the company tomorrow. So at which point maybe you're going in, finding that contact and marking them as inactive. Or maybe someone's just got married and they've changed their surname. So you're going in, finding that contact and updating their surname. So I can't actually think of many when you're transitioning between contacts and organizations, other than when it's a new company, a new client, a new contact, a new inquiry, those sorts of things.
Yeah, even then, if you think when you create, for example, if you have a new customer, like a new company, and you want to also store the contacts that you have from that company, you create the company and the customer, and then fill in the contacts for that customer. So you do switch between two pages, but there's a reason for that. And searching, I think, like you mentioned before, if I know what I'm going to search, like I'm going to search for a contact or a customer because I know that Virgin is a company or the name of the person is a contact. So switching between the two pages, I don't think that should happen that often.
Would it be a fair assumption, do you think, to in your scenario then you said you'd add an organization and then add customers? Would do you think it's likely that a better way of doing that would be you add the organization and then you somehow go into the organization to add customers, rather than add an organization and then go over to this other place called customers and join the two together?
That could be an option.
Yeah, definitely. Again, like looking forward to like how this could look in the future, the ability to, so at the moment all we can do is view issues for an organization or edit the organization. Now it could be in the drawer, but I envisage it maybe even in here that we could click on and it would drop down and expand and you would see the contacts within the organization. And maybe here we could have a new button, and that would add a new contact to this organization. So I could definitely see that happening in one view.
Then a lot of the back and forth between the two becomes, you don't lose the context of what you're doing. I'm on a contact and I want to go into that contact's organization. It's like a nice path there. And same, I'm in an organization and I want to go deeper with a contact. You've got that flow rather than moving around. And if it is like that, then I feel more comfortable with the choosing at the beginning, like the choosing organization first or contact first to make that way through. It might be worth speaking to the plan team about these things that are different but the same but different. What the team's working on, work items, tackling some of these problems of these different types of work items are different, but the mental model of those, or how the customers think about it, is they're all kind of the same thing and want a single entry point to move around and search stuff. So you might be able to learn from that team.
Yeah, I suppose even it's a bit specific, but even like with KRs and like objectives and KPIs, it's exactly the same screen, and you can just see one as a sort of child to the other, I guess. So yeah, and then issues and tasks and various other things that we have that they're a little bit more similarly shaped than contacts and organizations, but I can definitely see a world where
Could you open the edit button for the contact and for the organization, just to see what are the difference between the two?
Essentially. Might get my Chrome to play ball.
Yeah, because you see, like, the contact, you split up the name into first name and last name. And that's something that could be worked out if you have only one name entry. Email, it makes sense for an organization to have an email like the general info at something. Phone, that also makes sense to have an organization phone number.
But I don't necessarily think we even need to. I don't think we need to align the fields. I don't think that's a big problem. I think that we could have like one view.
I was thinking about that, to remove the differences between organization and contacts. So basically have one CRM entity.
Yeah.
And only say, okay, the difference between the two is that a contact, that an organization can have child contacts. It's like Epic and Issues. They're basically the same thing, but one can have children.
If we were going down that route, though, I'd probably even argue to go further and have like infinite levels of, say you could potentially have a head office company, and then child of that would be like a regional one, and then
you could.
But again, like it's struggling to get, like, draw the line between getting carried away, and I think Dan, like, by the sounds of it, like, bigger picture is really what you are interested in, and sort of the vision and the, like, how it all works, or you'd like it to work. But then at some point I have to rein myself in and say, but now what have we got? We've got 2 menu options. We want 1 menu option. What is the simplest way to reduce from 2 menu options down to 1 menu option? Now, the simplest, I think the simplest would be just to have a button, maybe. So you come into one, organizations, and you can press a button and that will take you to contacts, or vice versa. That'd be I think in my head, technically, the simplest solution would be that it defaults to one, whether it's contacts or organizations, don't really care. And then there's a button to switch to the other. That's where you'll probably say, Dan, that buttons aren't for navigation, so it shouldn't be a button, it should be a hyperlink or something like that. Yeah. But then you've bounced around some other ideas, which I feel like, yes, it's going to be a hell of a lot more effort, but I think it might be achievable and a nicer overall, like, rather than having a button. So you've got to, although ultimately clicking on a tab is no different to clicking on a button or a hyperlink. I suppose it depends if the page reloads or not. And if I can make it so the page doesn't reload, then that's a faster and maybe nicer experience.
And the tabs might be a terrible option. It was just something I threw out for additional consideration as well. I think it is helpful to have the big picture discussion so we know how to break it down into smaller steps. Like if we had clear evidence to say, hey, you know what, we should be thinking of these all as one type of object, it's going to be a lot easier to do that. It's going to be a lot easier and simpler to do that now than to switch it on. It has GA, customers start using it, and then we've got to migrate all of their data over to new models as well, even if they're simple now.
It's a really interesting proposition that Marco's dropped on us at this last stage, because it does sort of potentially give that ability to. I always tend to think you're always dealing with an individual, right? You can't just deal with a company hasn't got a brain, it hasn't got a mouth, it hasn't got hands, you can't interact with a company. So I think that was really my rationale for you attach contacts to issues. You know, who are you communicating with? You're communicating with an individual. But you know, I'm starting to kind of come around to the idea, definitely, like I said, of being able to have more of a hierarchy. I have definitely seen in the past where a company has maybe a finance department and an IT department and a few different teams, and maybe each of those departments needs to be billed separately. And that then becomes a bit challenging because you end up having to essentially create a separate organization for, you know, Virgin Finance and then Virgin IT, and
I just had a possibly terrible idea.
But before you share that idea, Marco, I just want to say thanks for inviting me to this call. I've got to jump off and do some other
thanks
stuff.
so much for coming on at no notice, Dan. Appreciate it, and I'll
But,
follow up with you on that.
Yeah, hopefully it was helpful for Maya and anyone else who watches this conversation later, for different ways that I think product designers can contribute to GitLab, the company, and GitLab, the product as well.
Yeah, I think it really was. Thanks, Dan. Appreciate that.
Sure. All the best, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. So
what's your next bombshell, Mark?
So my very bad idea is like, wouldn't it be nice to have a team, let's call it team, but it's not really a team. Like on GitLab, you have GitLab, then you have all the different groups, and you have a DRI for that group, and potentially one email and one phone number for your DRI. So like managing the company could be basically the highest level of the teams. Then you split it down, and then all the different groups, and then split it down again and have the people. And that would also solve another itch of like being able to have teams in GitLab, but that's outside the scope of CRM potentially.
Yeah, what do I think? So I'm trying to work out, is this just a way of grouping individuals, where I would possibly argue that, you know, just a description or another field for department or something like that, is that more what you're sort of getting to, or what more than that? What do you gain from and do you see this? I know we're talking about technical and implementation again, but, you know, is this where we've then aligned and we're only using one table, or is this a third table where we've got companies, like organizations are one entity, then we've got groups as another entity, then we've got individuals below that? Or
yeah, because managing teams would be only a nicer way of or maybe simpler way to have. Because right now on GitLab, if you want to manage teams, you have to create groups or projects and assign the members to that group or that project, and then you can use that as a team.
it depends like in what way can you use, like, are we still talking same purpose? Are we still talking about customers, or are you now talking about internal teams?
That's why I mentioned that it's probably outside of the scope of the CRM stuff, because it's
you're just thinking about creating an internal concept of teams in GitLab to be able to.
Yeah, that's more internal to us as a company building to,
and that would be more related to users, right, than CRM contacts. But I'm still like, I am still interested in the sort of hierarchical, but I know what Dan said is true, that if it becomes GA, or although looking at it, I forgot, it looks like we don't have it behind a feature flag anymore, but it's just not default.
No, it's not behind a feature flag, but it's probably flagged as experimental.
Not
Beta.
sure if experimental existed when I created this.
So maybe it's in beta.
I don't know if that existed. Like I say, I think that's quite a new concept. It's nothing about.
Oh wow, this is already GA.
It is. I mean, like it's 2 years since I implemented it. Like the thing, I mean, again, conversation that I don't should really be or don't really want to be having, but like, you know, what does it all mean? Like, I think we used to. I'm more familiar with this is a minimal. Is it minimal or minimum viable or whatever you want to call it? I think we used to have like minimal, then viable, then something, then lovable or something like that. And this is like bare minimum. Like it caters for half a dozen use cases, and there's many more. But you know, I don't see any reason to. Like if we need to change it, we follow the usual deprecations process or whatever it is, if it's breaking change, or if not, just kind of push it further. But I really I still kind of would love to agree on a solution to this.
I think that we should go for a boring solution to fix the layout or page switching and stuff like that. But then we could have a serious talk with Plan, probably. I guess that would be the most suited group on how we could improve the CRM stuff. Because being able to have multiple levels.
So just sorry to interrupt you there, but the challenge is that I don't want to say they're not interested, but they're not interested. Like they need customer, they don't have their own thoughts and views on it, is how I understand it at the moment. They need their customers to drive it, or our customers to drive it, or whatever you want to call it. And you are one of those customers. I was one of those customers, etc. So
the prevented you from bouncing more ideas around is that you basically were the only one working on this, so you only had your view. And that
exactly.
makes perfect sense.
Exactly that. And you know, the good thing is, I mean, I did it all out in the open. Like I will remember, you know, until the day I die, probably the issue number.
Oh really?
Well, I mean, it's in the thousands, which for a start is, I mean, it's low thousands as well. So, you know, it's a 6-year-old, 6.5-year-old now issue. And like obviously 60 odd MRs went into it. It was a big thing, but you know, everything from the early days when I was brainstorming like entity models or whatever you want to call it, it was all there for the taking for anyone to sort of, but you're right, like I guess there aren't that many people, I don't know what you would call it, but like pioneers or whatever going on and sort of thinking like, oh, this is something I'd love, and like get involved in those kind of conversations. Or I certainly wasn't capable of doing that kind of UX customer outreach to try and get those people involved. So going back to boring solutions, right?
So, boring solution for me is like fixing the UI for what it's now.
So what do you mean by fixing? Because the UI isn't broken.
Not really fixing, but the thing that you brought up before, or that Dan brought up before, like we have to switch pages and stuff like that. So if we want to make a change to the UI, the most boring solution for now would be this one, basically the 2 tabs and the button potentially. But I would go for, even if it's not this one, go for the solution with the less effort, and then have another brainstorm on the current status of the CRM stuff and how it could be improved. And if it turns out that we want to support multiple levels, then then decide whether or not we want to go down that route. And if we want, we should definitely have a look at the usage of what's currently in-house. Like, we have people that can make queries on the production database and see how many contacts, how many organizations.
Yeah.
So we can also make a decision on whether or not we want to. Well, it is still possible, because migrating this amount of data or this kind of data isn't that huge of a deal. And we could potentially rework the existing GraphQL services to work on the new table, because we should only fix, well, not fix, but use the right different table. So forward for that exists. We just need to decide whether or not it's the case of following that path.
Trying to see if I can make a query on the database. I can never remember whether I actually can or not. I've managed to do it before, but maybe not. Just do it. I've got it. So what do we want to explain? Select. Excuse me. Select star from customer relations contacts. See if that works. I'm interested to know if it's less than 100.
Well, how many did you use? Well, you're on self-hosted. So.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the thing. It might be something that is more commonly used on self-hosted. Yeah, see, definitely the simplest solution, like at the moment, would be a button to switch. So like the menu item takes you to contacts. So maybe we just change the menu to customer relations rather than customer relations, contacts, or organization. That takes you to contacts, and then on there's a button to jump to organizations. But like I said, I know that buttons aren't supposed to be used for.
You could have a link button on the left side of the new contact or new organization to like view contacts or view organizations.
I think that's the solution. So I think there are just over 1,000.
Oh, really?
I say it doesn't hugely surprise me. In organizations as well. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Let me do an MR to introduce just a link to, and I could even introduce that. Yeah, because that it's interesting because I bet this MR's royally messed up now, conflicts and needing major rebasing. Because it was 47 files were changed. I think mostly that was specs though, hopefully. I forgot to use the word explain. But yeah, I'll raise an MR for that. And what I want to do is try and use my GCK because I need to really put it for its paces and see how it's working. And yeah, about 1,000 organizations as well. So slightly fewer than there were contacts, but roughly the same in .com at the moment.
Yeah, and 1,000 of each isn't that big of a deal.
Oh no, for a migration, I mean, I guess you'd normally batch in sort of batches of 1,000 or 10,000 or something like that. So yeah.
Even if we want to go to make that change, we could do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe you could start an issue discussing that potential for aligning in that way. Although I'm still kind of trying to get my head around like what we gain from that if we align things in such a way. I guess like
we need levels of
hierarchical structure, like whether that be like departments or teams, like the finance department, the IT department, the marketing department, from the same company, or whether that be different branches or different regions or different a hierarchical type structure. That introduces fun though, right? When you have recursion
yes
kind of like, I don't know what you want to call it, like reporting and querying and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, easy solution, expand one level at a time.
Maybe. I'm trying to think where the problems come with like groups. I think it's because like if you wanted to say, show me all of the issues that relate to this organization, this CRM entity, it would then have to check all of that children and their children and their children and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think that the best solution for that would be build a list of all the IDs for the CRM entities that are children to that root object, and then the query would be select all the issues where the organization ID is inside of this set.
Yeah, but duplication's never nice, right, in the database.
Duplication for what?
Well, you're saying presumably, right? So if you've got, let's say, just 3 levels, so you've got a parent company, departments at that company, and then individuals within those departments.
Yes.
If I say, give me all the issues for this company, then somewhere you're saying to store a list of all of the individual IDs against.
Oh no, you get that from a query.
But that has to use recursion, though, right?
Yeah, but not to fetch the issues. That would be bad. If you have to fetch only the CRM entities, that wouldn't be that bad. I'm not a database person, so.
Well, I'm sure you've looked at how we do groups before in the past, and you should know how complex that is.
Yeah, but groups is a much bigger deal than. Because
it is, but we should learn from our mistakes and like pretend that this is going to grow and not build it in a way that we know doesn't scale.
That's true, but I would love to have feedback from someone on the database team on that.
Yeah. No. Feel free to create an issue, and I will try and solve this problem in a simple way. And the good thing is, though, I can leave this existing MR, because this existing MR is just about changing the default. I can spin up a new MR to add the button that just allows you, because I think it would already be a nice thing to have, because at the moment, if you're looking at contacts and you want to jump to organizations or vice versa, you have to go back to plan, and then exactly. Whereas being able to flick to it just by clicking a link would actually be a nice thing to have. So awesome. Thank you very much, and thank you, Nicholas, for a few of your nuggets that saved me a headache there. Good to see you all. Catch you later on.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Have a great day. Bye.
Bye-bye.